From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, all. Welcome to LJ 119 and to the Kluge Center for a very exciting event today. We're delighted to welcome our friend, Dr. José Casanova, who's been with us for much of the last year as Kluge Chair in the Cultures of the North. And I want to welcome many friends from the Kluge past, former fellows. I just met one, and friends from Georgetown University. I want to acknowledge James and Constance from the EU delegation to the US, who have been working with us on many programs and ideas. And I believe there are friends from the Embassy of Spain here today. In addition to being a Kluge Center event, we're delighted to co-sponsor today's event with our friends from the European Union and all of the European embassies. May is the European Month of Culture. This is the 5th year of that program. It's a month-long festival with a succession of cultural events held around Washington, including in the embassies, highlighting the diverse cultures of the 28 countries in the EU. And today's lecture, in addition to being an event of the Kluge Center and of the Library of Congress, is an official event of the EU Month of Culture. Before I get any further, if you are carrying an electronic device, a cell phone, if you'll take a moment to silence your phones, this presentation will be filmed. The Kluge Center brings together scholars and researchers from around the world in a global network nearly as well articulated as the Jesuit network that we're going to hear about today. And they come and do research just down this hallway in their offices and throughout the library, in our reading rooms, in our rich collections. And it's a constant and evolving community, and we're delighted to welcome all of you into our community today. Dr. Casanova is one of the world's top scholars in the sociology of religion. He's a professor in the departments of sociology and theology at Georgetown, a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center. His work focuses on globalization, religion, and secularization. During his time here over the past half a year, he's been working on his manuscript, Early Modern Globalization Through a Jesuit Prism, which is the title of his talk today. He's published an immense range of articles and for publications and edited books on religion, globalization, migration, religious pluralism, transnational religions, and sociological theory. His best-known work, Public Religions in the Modern World, came out in 1994, has become a modern classic and been translated into 5 languages, including Arabic and Indonesian. In 2012, he was awarded the Theology Prize from the Salzburger Hochschulwochen in recognition of lifelong achievement in the field of theology. And I'll just add as an aside that Jose can speak or read, true to his global topic, he can speak or read French, German, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, and Ukrainian, in addition to his native Spanish. While here, he greatly added to our sense of collegiality and collaboration. He was a reliable mentor to our younger scholars and a delightful colleague for those of us on the Kluge staff, so it's a real pleasure to see him today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. José Casanova.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Ted, for this kind introduction. And I would like, first of all, to express my gratitude, my deep gratitude, for this fantastic time I spent here at the Kluge Center the last 5 months, for all the help and the company of the entire staff that they've helped me. And also I want to especially recognize the nameless staff that bring the books to our offices. From the first day, I felt like a kid in a candy store. You ask for candy, and in 2 hours, it gets there. Candy of all shapes, languages. Is the only place where you can get precisely books in every language you can possibly know and every other language you don't know. So thank you very much. And of course, I want to also recognize Emily, who has been also helping here at the Kluge, for actually putting my lecture in PowerPoint shape. So thank you very much, Emily. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great honor. And this project is a follow-up. Basically, 3 years ago, we directed a project on the Jesuits and globalization. It was a collective project. The volume came out at Georgetown University Press. And here I'm expanding the framework of the volume into a monographic study. So, early modern globalization through a Jesuit prism. So the first question is, why early modern globalization? Because usually we think that globalization either began yesterday, 89 or something, or is simply a continuation of modern Western hegemony, modernization to the entire globe. So it was meant early modern to challenge precisely our modernist and Eurocentric assumptions that assume that everything begins with modernity. There was tradition before, then there is modernity, and everything that happened before is basically irrelevant. And globalization is supposed to be simply an expansion of modernization to the globe. By pointing out that there was early modern globalization before modernity, before Western hegemony, it means that the dynamic of globalization cannot be understood simply as a continuation of Western modernity. So the question is, globalization can only be defined in the most abstract and general terms, precisely because if you define it concretely, you will define only part of it, a period of it, or one which is characterized by economic, or by politics, or by cultures. So it can only be defined in abstract and general terms as the process through which the world, the entire globe, becomes a single place with increasing global connectivity between peoples, societies, and cultures, with humanity attaining an increasing global consciousness. Now, globalization proper, and that's why early modern globalization, begins only once the circumnavigations of the globe in the early modern era, after 1492, made possible for the first time both global connectivity and global consciousness. Of course, there were connectivities before. All of Eurasia and Africa had been connected for millennia, certainly for centuries, at least since the Axial Age. And the Axial Age, to a certain extent, all the great cultures already anticipated a global consciousness, a global humanity, some kind of ethical universalism or logical universalism. But this anticipation only becomes a reality with precisely the global connectivity and the global consciousness made possible by the early modern circumnavigations of the globe. Globalization, therefore, is a process, a complex process that cannot be reduced to any single factor, and an even process, namely, it happens differently in different parts of the globe at different rates, at different times, affecting differently different peoples. So it's not an even process across the globe. It's a multidimensional process. It cannot be defined unlike or neither as world capitalism or world geopolitics or simply world technology in the sense of mass media, and is experienced differently by different people in different places. Therefore, when we use globalization as an independent variable to explain things, probably we are not doing right. Namely, globalization itself doesn't produce anything, does not cause anything, is only a process, the condition and context within which all kinds of socio-historical processes take place. So in this, a kind of a conceptual framework, why globalization? Why the Jesuits? This is the more interesting question. Why the Jesuits? In the early modern era, they serve as pioneer globalizers In a sense, one can say that they were the first organized group in history to think and to act globally. If you can think of any other group that did it before them, please let me know, because I have made this claim and nobody has ever challenged this claim. So far, no historian has challenged this claim that indeed they were the first organized group in history to think and to act globally. Arguably, for over 200 years, from their foundation in 1540 to their papal suppression in 1773, no other group contributed as much to the advancement of global connectivity and global consciousness, linking the four quadrants of the world. They serve as primary brokers. In this respect, they were not themselves the ones that produce the process, but they serve as brokers linking North and South and East and West. And how did they do it? First of all, through their ubiquitous missions. Yes, I mean, we don't have a map here, but just think of the coast of Japan, China, going down all the way, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, to the Mariana Islands, and then all the Indian Ocean, the coast of India, the coast of Africa, and then all the way to the Americas. Basically, they had global missions everywhere, from North America to South America, throughout Africa, throughout Asia, basically one generation after their foundation. But also through their prodigious production and global circulation of annual letters. They were prodigious letter writers. Ignatius himself probably was the greatest letter writer of his age. Nobody has, at least the letter writing of nobody else has survived in so many volumes as Ignatius' letters. And he makes sure that his children, his spiritual children, also were prodigious letter writers. But they were also, besides being private letter writers, they were very good in keeping all these documents, archiving them, and then reproducing them, publishing them as public annual letters and edifying mission reports. But in addition to that, they were scientific and ethnographic describers. They were the first, to a certain extent, ethnographers of the entire globe. They did geographic mapping of most of the areas of the world. They had cartographic exercises all the way from the Philippines to the Amazonas, from China to North America. Astronomical observations. Clavius, the great mathematician, Jesuit mathematician and astronomer, who was the teacher of all the first generation at the Collegio Romano. He himself was a great colleague, older than Galileo. Galileo had him as the greatest astronomer of his time. And basically, he was practically the person who was in charge of the reform of the Gregorian calendar. And the Jesuits went to China and will have precisely do the same kind of revision of the Chinese calendar. Also through the construction of numerous scripts, lexicons and grammars of non-Western languages. Again, whenever they came to a region that had no scripts, usually it will be the Jesuits that developed the scripts for many of the native people. The Vietnamese script used today in Vietnam is the script developed by Alexander de Rhodes. Think of the Guarani language. It's a language basically created by the Jesuits out of different dialects, but has remained the only language in Latin America which is spoken not Spanish. So in Paraguay, the kind of the successor nation to the Guarani redactions, although the elites speak Spanish, the majority of the population only speaks Guarani. So it's the only Latin American nation that was Christianized without being Hispanized through the Jesuits. They also served as, because they knew so many languages, as pioneer comparative linguistics. To a certain extent, they invented what later will become comparative linguistics, the same way that they were the first really comparative ethnographers. In this respect, they serve as pioneer global cultural brokers through the translation of classical Greek and Latin text into non-Western language. Ricci, translated Euclidean geometric principles of geometry, would translate aphorisms from Greek and Latin in his great, the most successful book that he wrote in Chinese, and Friendship, basically from memory, was able to reconstruct those aphorisms and became, because of that, he became a great also Confucian literatus. But also the translation of non-Western classical texts into Latin. Chinese, the classical Confucian Chinese texts were first translated by the Jesuits into Latin in several translations, first Ricci and then many others, and it was these texts that later were translated into every European language that led to the great interest in Chinese affairs, let's say, especially in the 18th century, the age in which China became the focus of so many interests by philosophers, political theories, especially throughout the Enlightenment. But besides Chinese, also you have the Nobile, the first translator of Sanskrit and Tamil languages into Tamil texts, into Latin. Ippolito Desideri, the first translator of Tibetan classical texts also. In this respect, they serve as pioneer Orientalists. Before Orientalism became a discipline in the Western Academy at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, the Jesuits had served for over a century as first Japanologists. Balignano can be said to be the first Western expert on Japan, Ricci the first sinologist, De Nobile the first Sanskritist, Desideri the first Tibetanologist. But not only there, of course, in Latin America, they were not the pioneers because they came 50 years after already the spiritual conquest of the Americas had taken place. But even there, they play a crucial role. We'll mention José de Acosta, especially through the production of catechisms. They were not only scientists, they were also primarily missionaries. So the most important text they would write in every other language, non-Western language, was the catechism. This was the age, of course, of the catechism. Luther's catechism was the one that really spread the Protestant Reformation throughout Europe, and out of it came also the Catholic catechisms, the Trent Catechism of Trent, and the Jesuits would always precisely write catechisms for each culture, accommodating precisely this culture. They're not simply copies of Trent catechisms. They are catechisms written specifically for the particular culture in every possible vernacular. But also through the global circulation of all kinds of objects, scientific instruments, from the telescope that they brought to China and the quadrant and many other scientific instruments. They also brought, of course, the science of canon making. They helped to make canons for the Chinese Empire, the same way they were making canons and fortifications during the religious wars for Catholic kings in Europe. So in this respect, they were not only missionaries and not only scientists, but they were also hard geopolitical realists, helping also the kingdoms, which they were also serving as scholars. Printing presses, typescripts, they brought, of course, this is the age also of the printing press, and they were able to fuse in Asia the European printing press, and of course the Chinese script. They had already their own printing press for centuries, but they were able to precisely use and fuse the two techniques to print in all kinds of Asian languages, but also in all kinds of non-Western languages. Botanic plants, medicinal plants. You may have heard of the Jesuit bark, quinine. Quinine was called the Jesuit bark because it was they who brought it from Latin America and became, of course, very important for the tropics everywhere. Sacred objects of all kinds that they distributed throughout the globe. If you go to Latin America, to museums in sacred objects throughout Latin America, whether in Mexico or in Peru, you will find ivory Jesus, baby Jesuses, ivory crosses from Manila, made in Manila by Chinese craftsmen for the Catholic global markets. In the same way that today's Chinese do Christmas ornaments for the entire world, already the Chinese in Manila, in Chinatown, did Catholic small sculptures for the entire global Catholic market. Icons, paintings, and sculptures. This was probably the first global age of art, in which you have really the first intercultural encounters between Japanese painting and Western painting. They brought, of course, the techniques of Western painting, including, obviously, I'm looking over it. The word fails me now. Anyhow, the Western techniques, and they brought Japanese and Chinese techniques. They brought the Western painting techniques to the court in Beijing, but also to the Guarani missions, but also to Eastern Ukraine, to the Orthodox regions. And indeed, these people talk of the global Jesuit Baroque, the kind of the first, again, global age of architecture you find all over the globe, but also music, drama, and ballet. Music was central. It's important to understand that audiovisual modes of communication were central in the Jesuit mission, in the Jesuit way of portraying the gospel and educating in the schools. And music, drama, and ballet became central in the education of the Jesuit colleges that we will see in a moment. You may think of French ballet having been first invented in the Jesuit college Louis-le-Grand in Paris. It was there where French ballet was born, the same way that much of the Italian opera precisely was appropriated by Jesuits, the Jesuit drama, and then was globalized in Jesuit colleges all over the world. You have basically representations very close to Italian opera in Goa, in Macau, in Lima, in Cusco, and so on. So what explains their success as pioneer globalizers? A combination of external opportunity structures and internal institutional and organizational advantages. Let's look first at three main external opportunity structures. First, the Iberian colonial expansion. This was what made them global missionaries. They were carried by Portuguese and Spanish colonial ships. The Portuguese padroado was the system whereby the Catholic king of Portugal became the patron of the Catholic missions throughout his empire in exchange for, obviously, sponsoring the missions financially, but of course the missions helping construct the Portuguese empire. The same happened with the Patronato Real of the Spanish Empire. So it was these two, the Padroado Portuguese and the Spanish Patronato, that together, because the Portuguese controlled the East Indies through circumnavigating Africa and all the way to India, Goa, Macau, Malacca. And the Spanish controlled the Americas all the way to the Philippines. So there were two global routes. One, the Portuguese controlled circumnavigating Africa. The Spanish controlled the route from Manila to Acapulco, through Mexico City, through Veracruz, Havana, and from Havana to Spain. And then, so this circumnavigation was made possible by this precisely, the joining the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. And very frequently, when letters went from Rome to China, or a letter from China to Rome, they would be sent precisely in several copies via the two different routes to make sure that at least one of them will reach so you have basically every letter from Rome will go one circumnavigating Africa via the Portuguese, the other through the Americas, through the New World to Manila, and from there to Japan and to China, etc. Manila at the time was not the periphery of, it was really the center of kind of network of communication between China and Europe, but through the New World. There's a fantastic book of poems by Bernardo de Sahagún, 1605, in Mexico City, La Grandeza Mexicana. And this is a poem to how Mexico City is the center of the globe. Every idea, every product, every commodity, and he mentions basically the Mughal Empire, the Persian Empire, the Chinese Empire, Japan, the Ottoman Empire, and products from all of these parts of the globe all come through Mexico City. So again, Mexico City was not a periphery of this global where, in fact, there was more communication between Mexico City and China, then there goes between Mexico City, let's say, and Northern Europe at the time, let's say, what later would become, of course, the main carriers of globalization. So the Manila Galleon was what made possible the linking of East and West through the Americas, because it was this new world that made it into a global. There had been, of course, a lot of connectivity in Euro or Afro-Eurasia, connecting China, connecting what had been Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, and Islam. Up to the 15th century, Islam had been the carrier, the kind of the one linking Asia, Africa, and Europe. It was now the emergence of the new world and the linking all of these parts of the globe that, of course, made this possible. So the Jesuits were carried to their missions by Portuguese and Spanish colonial ships. The great Jesuit missionary of Brazil, Antonio Vieira, put it most succinctly in his Historia do Futuro. Think of the title for a book, Historia do Futuro. And he was, of course, a visionary. He was an apocalyptic thinker and thinking how the world is going to develop. And I quote, "If there were not merchants who go to seek for earthly treasures in the East and West Indies, who would transport thither the preachers who take heavenly treasures? The preachers take the gospel, and the merchants take the preachers." But what's interesting is that Jesuit preachers went beyond the limits of the Portuguese and Spanish empires to places in India, the Malabar, in Japan, to Kyoto, in China, to Beijing, in Tibet, where neither Western merchants nor colonialists had access. So it is not proper to simply limit the Jesuit globalization to simply being carried by, let's say, global capitalism, because precisely where capitalism could not enter, they were able to start precisely these intercultural encounters. And even within the Western colonial empires of the New World in the Americas, in New France, in New Spain, in the Virreinato of Peru, Jesuits established missions in the outskirts, in the frontiers of the empires where European colonists did not settle. Think, of course, of the most famous Guarani reductions in Paraguay, but also the missions to the Mapuche Indians in Chile, the missions to the Indians in Baja California, of course, the missions to the North American Indians all the way from the Iroquois to Milwaukee, down the Mississippi to Louisiana. So the second external, this was the golden age of global Catholic missions. Jesuits were neither the only nor the first global Catholic missionaries. They follow in the steps of other Catholic religious orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinian, and others, who preceded them in the great global Catholic missions of the 16th century. As I already mentioned, to the Americas they came late. To Spanish America they only really reached in the 1570s, almost 70 years after, or at least 50 years after the spiritual conquest of the Americas had already taken place. And the same goes for the Filipinas, the same goes for Goa, the same goes for Macau. But it is precisely what made them unique. In this respect, it was part of these larger global Catholic missions. This was the age in which Catholicism became the first global world religion. And this we have to keep in mind, 250 years before the beginning of any continuous Protestant missions. I mean, the Protestant missions only begins in earnest at the end of the 18th century, and well before John Wesley's famous expression, "I see the world as my parish." You have Jerome Nadal's. Jerome Nadal was a very important, probably the most, after Ignatius, probably the person that was most influential in shaping the first generation of Jesuits. He was probably the only person who met personally the first 1,000 Jesuits at the death of Ignatius. He visited every Jesuit province, every Jesuit college, every Jesuit house, especially bringing the draft of the Constitution. And in this respect, he contributed more than anybody else to what could be called the Jesuit esprit de corps. And he coined the famous slogan, "The world is our home, tutus mundus fit habitatio est." But here it is the world is our home in the context where he describes we Jesuits have three houses: the house of the novices, the houses of the profess, the colleges, and then we have our fourth home. Our real home is the world. And it is this notion that the whole world, the globe, is our home that precisely is what makes them into globalizers. Other Catholic orders had missions. The Dominicans had missions, the Franciscans, but the whole order was not defined as a missionary order. The Jesuits were born as a missionary order. The specific ministry of the Jesuits was to be sent ad missiones. Upon entering the Society of Jesus, members took an oath to be ready to be sent ad missiones to any part of the world where they could help souls, particularly in the so-called New Indies. In this respect, global mobility was culturally encoded in the DNA of the Jesuit order from its very inception. Two of the most controversial organizational aspects of the new order, their abandonment of the traditional monastic choir, and the other religious orders would not like it, the fact that they have broken with this, and neither the Curia in Rome, or that they will not have really monastic communities, that they didn't dress in any specific monastic habit, but that they could wear any habit anywhere where they were. So this first, and the second, their fourth specific vow of obedience to the Universal Bishop of Rome, precisely because he has the jurisdiction to send them ad missiones universally everywhere. So these two had their origin precisely in this intentional disposition to global mobility. Finally, a third external structure, which also has been there 50 years before, at least, before the Jesuits emerged, the culture of Christian Renaissance humanism. Ignatius stayed in the Montagu College in Paris, in the same college where Erasmus first, and later Calvin had stayed. And of course, Erasmus was the great Christian Renaissance humanist of the time, but also all the universities of the time were permeated by this culture of Christian Renaissance humanism that then the Jesuits incorporated into their colleges. And although, of course, they were born as a missionary order, they became most famous as educators, as teachers, as the first professional schoolmasters. In this respect, they were the first Catholic teaching order. Or every other religious male and female order after has followed the Jesuits in being a teaching order. But the first Catholic teaching order were the Jesuits. In this respect, they were also the first transnational professional organization of schoolmasters. In a sense, they invented the profession. Teaching was not originally envisioned as a particular Jesuit ministry. When they were founded in 1540, they had no intention of establishing any school, although they all, the founders, had degrees from University of Paris. But the establishment of the first Jesuit school in Messina, Sicily, in 1548 was to have dramatic repercussions in the structure and the development of the order. The great historian, Jesuit historian, John O'Malley, calls it rightly a second foundation. It radically transformed the order. They're not only missionaries on the move, now they become sedentary teachers in places. And it is out of this tension or this combination of mission and college that the Jesuits as a unique organization will be shaped. And of course, the dramatic growth of the society also accompanied the growth of Jesuit colleges. It was through Jesuit colleges that the Jesuit order grew, and the growth allowed for more colleges everywhere. Look at these figures. 1533, when they had the oath in Montmartre, in Paris, the 7 companions, there were 7 of them. When the order was established in 1540, there were 10 founding members in Rome. At the death of Ignatius, 16 years later, in 1556, already over 1,000 members and 46 colleges. 20 years later, or 25 years later, multiplication of members by 5, over 5,000 members, colleges by 3, over 144 colleges. 50 years later, again, multiplication by 3, from 5,000 to 15,000, and colleges by 3, 444 colleges. By 1749, on the eve of their expulsion from Portugal, where it all started, there are over 22,000 members and over 800 colleges throughout Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Most of them were in Europe, but they were several dozen colleges throughout the Americas, and more than a dozen colleges throughout Asia. What was uniquely distinctive of the Jesuit college, because at that time you also have Protestants developing colleges in the Protestant territories. What was unique was precisely its global orientation, which Stephen Harris, the historian of science, has called the Jesuit geography of knowledge. An instruction from Ignatius, he would tell his missionaries that he himself sent to send all kinds of novel information, because there's a lot of curiosity in Europe, and you know, it can be edifying. This curiosity can lead to edifying purposes as well. But of course, the interesting thing is that they were able to send not only, if you wish, religious information, or even merchants, of course, sent also intelligence information on business or on geology, on geopolitics. But the Jesuits, precisely because of the training they had as, if you wish, scholars, as Renaissance humanists, they were ready to send data of natural, historical, geographic, demographic, ethnographic, linguistic, artistic, all of these data sent from the missions, from all over the world, into the colleges in Europe, was processed there as scientific information and was sent back to all the colleges, the Jesuit colleges, reaching the missions. And it is this back and forth between missions and colleges, between missions in the Americas and missions in Asia, between colleges in Europe and colleges in the Americas and in Goa and in Macau, that precisely turned the Jesuits into a pioneer globalizer. So it was this virtuous feedback of Jesuit knowledge production between the global network of Jesuit missions and the global network of Jesuit colleges what made the Jesuits into pioneer globalizers. Again, as in so many other things, Jesuits were not so much the originators as the effective global carriers of a wider culture of Christian universal humanism that emerged out of the fusion of Aristotelian Thomist scholasticism and Renaissance humanism. The scholasticism of the universities, the humanism of the Italian colleges, they were fused together in the Jesuit college that had both this humanist and this scientific scholarly form. And they crystallized in the school of Salamanca first. Francisco de Vitoria was, of course, a Dominican, so was Melchior Cano, but then in Coimbra, which was the first Jesuit university, where much of this knowledge in which the Jus Gentium will be developed further by Suarez and the others. So in this respect, through the prism of globalization, one can view the Society of Jesus as the particular crystallization of the world historical conjuncture of three interrelated processes: the Iberian colonial expansion, the early modern Catholic revival, and the culture of Christian Renaissance humanism. But of course, those were external opportunity structures, and they were available to many other groups. Other groups did not take advantage of these structures to turn into pioneer globalizers. So you have to find out what was there in the internal structure of the Jesuits that allowed them to play this role. And one could argue that it was their peculiar character as an inner-worldly, activist, and highly mobile transnational religious order that occupied an interstitial role between the imperial Catholic powers and the papacy. And in particular, three peculiar Jesuit institutional characteristics: Ignatian spirituality. This is crucial for the formation of the Jesuit as a person, as a self. A peculiar combination of an ethic of critical self-examination and discernment, personal self-abnegation and control, dedication to the service of others and to the common good. Again, it is the first religious order that has written its constitutions not only for the greater glory of God, but for the common good. And the colleges were not only to, if you wish, to convert, to proselytize, but for the common good. And the common good, of course, became then a universal mission without clear distinctions between the religious and the profane. And openness to the world, seeking God in all things, all of it grounded in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. This was the paradigmatic Jesuit manual and technique of the self. In this respect, from the beginning until now, every Jesuit is a spiritual child of Ignatius, basically reproducing internally within itself the same process of transformation that Ignatius found in the spiritual exercises. So what it produced is an organization of self-directed and relatively autonomous individuals that could be expected to be sent to any part of the world where they were expected to reproduce faithfully the peculiar Jesuit way of proceeding. It was obedience at long distance. A lot of ink has been written about perinde a cadaver, the fact that they are supposed to obey as dead automatons. But the fact is that when Ritchie got to China, he was alone there. And he had to make decisions. What is the Jesuit way of proceeding? How should I proceed as a Jesuit? And of course, any question he sent to Rome took 2 years to get there, and the answer would take another 2 years. So in the meantime, he had to find what the Jesuit way of proceeding is. And of course, it is the famous method of accommodation that you could say is already built into the spiritual exercises. Because spiritual exercises, from the very beginning, are written as a manual for the person that gives the spiritual exercises and asking this person to accommodate the exercises to the specific spiritual needs and characteristics of the person taking the exercises. So again, the very method of the spiritual exercises is one of accommodation to the spiritual particularity of the individual. The same goes, Ignatius would send very specific instructions. When you go there, do that and do that and do that. But after all, once you get there, you know best how to proceed our way. And this is in every letter at the end, after giving very precise instructions, but ultimately, you will know best. You will have to use your own judgment. It is this precisely unique form of organizational structure, and this is the second one, is a hierarchic, centralized organization with a highly flexible managerial style and a global system of communication. So it's a novel and typically modern organizational structure, hierarchical and centralized, spelled out in minute details in the first written constitution. Before any state constitution, the Jesuits wrote the constitution that later would become a model, you could say, for a lot of state constitutions, at least in the written form of the structure. But accompanied by a highly flexible, mobile, and pragmatic managerial style that could accommodate the most diverse and unexpected local circumstances. And this pragmatic managerial style was facilitated by a highly developed and efficient global system of communications linking all the Jesuit centers with one another, including all the regional and global peripheries to the Jesuit provinces and the Roman Curia. Through the system of letter writing, there was a communication of every Jesuit to his superior, who wrote to his superior, who wrote, and so on, and communications not only vertically, but also horizontally across the global networks. And finally, it is global reach as a transnational and papal order. It is the autonomous structure they were able to develop as a papal order that claimed to have universal jurisdiction anywhere, but at the same time was being sponsored by different Catholic kings. So they were protected by the Spanish king, but who was in conflict with the Portuguese king, who was protecting the Jesuits, and the French king, but precisely because they were subject to so many different jurisdictions, they were, to a certain extent, you could say, subject to none. And it is autonomy that allowed them to develop this, you could say, peculiar project of globalization that eventually would actually clash with what will become later the hegemonic projects of globalization, of Western-centric hegemony in the 19th century. But at least for 2 centuries, they developed a global organization that can be said to be the first global NGO, the first global non-governmental organization before the consolidation of the modern Westphalian system of nation states. This was the source of their autonomy. They are of unique project of globalization. It will take us much longer to try to spell out how this project of globalization was different from the ones that eventually triumphed. But it was clear it was this conflict between the Jesuit project and the other project of globalization, which eventually will triumph in the 18th and the 19th centuries, that led to their suppression, to their expulsion from every country where they had been famous and successful. Again, we don't have time here to follow the process of expulsion, first from Japan, then from China, then from Portugal, then from France, then from Spain, to the final suppression by the Pope in 1773. But it is by precisely reconstructing, is what I will be doing in the book I'm writing now, by reconstructing these expulsions and suppressions that one can find what were the conflicts between the Jesuit project of globalization and the other emerging interests. So with this, let me just, I'm already taking too long, briefly globalization through a Jesuit prism. It was the intercultural encounters and the Jesuit method of accommodation that defines precisely this particular form of globalization. This was an era before Western hegemony, when there was not a world system. Those were connected, interconnected histories. Nobody can write the history of the globe in the 16th or the 17th century because it has no center. They are connected histories, but there are multiple histories. Western powers could not subjugate the Mughal Empire, the Chinese Empire, Japan, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire. So there was no Western hegemony in this period in which the Jesuits precisely served as brokers, connecting these different parts of the world together. They themselves had not a project of hegemony. It was more a project of intercultural encounters. But it is important to look at this model because it fosters a revisionist perspective that perceives the globalization that triumphed, the modern globalization from 1789 to 1989, as a particular phase of global history, the one of Western hegemony that was preceded, however, by an early modern form of globalization before Western hegemony, and is being succeeded today by a third novel form of globalization we are entering, we are not sure yet which shape it's going to take after Western hegemony. And the idea is we need to free ourselves from the Eurocentric, Western-centric concepts of globalization to be open to the new postmodern, post-Western globalization emerging today. It was Balignano, the first one, who gave a kind of expression to this method of accommodation. His famous saying, "Our task is not to Portugalize the Chinese, but to make Christianity Chinese." Again, I don't have the time to go here into detail, but we must see the Jesuits as Renaissance humanists that have made saints of the pagan philosophers, Saint Cicero, Saint Seneca, Saint Socrates, and that come to these other cultures and can make Saint Confucius. Because what Ricci found out is that actually, and this was his point, Chinese culture, without revelation, has reached a level, if you could, of natural law, ethics, and a conception of the cosmos, of the universe, which is basically almost in perfect tune with the view of revelation. So they came the closest, much closer than the pagan philosophers we've made sense. So much more can we make Comfy into Saint Confucius. Confucius, of course, is a name invented by Ricci, but it's the way we know Confucianism everywhere. But it was an invention, it was a manufacturing of Ricci, and there's a huge book, Manufacturing Confucianism, how Ricci basically came to this interpretation of Confucianism, trying to convince the literati, the Chinese literati, that their own interpretation was wrong. My interpretation of Confucius is the one really close to Kung Tzu, and you should follow it. We can argue about which interpretation was better or closer to the origins. The point is that there is a certainly willingness to argue. They call themselves apostles to the Gentiles, the same as Paul. It's not by chance that every Jesuit college in Goa, in Macau, in Japan, in Cusco, in Lima, are called San Pablo, San Paul, because they saw themselves as doing for the new globe, for the new world, what St. Paul did for the Gentiles. And if St. Paul could go to the Areopagos in Athens and talk of the unknown God, that's what Ricci was doing in China, and that's what the Jesuits were doing in India and in Tibet. And the idea was, if Christianity that was originally Hebrew or Aramaic, Jewish, had to become Hellenic, and had to become Latin in two different forms, Hellenic Greek Christianity and Latin Christianity, there is room for Japanese Christianity, Chinese Christianity, Indian Christianity. And Christianity can only become a universal religion, truly, if it becomes inculturated, incarnated in every particular culture. It is this separation between this conception of universal religion that has no culture, pure religion, and particular cultures. Of course, any sociologist, this is the key distinction between religion and culture. All the debates in religious studies, in the sociology and anthropology of religion, is how this differentiation of religion and culture took place. Well, it took place first in China, when Matteo Ricci decided which parts of Chinese culture were civic customs, therefore not idolatrous rites, and as such could then become Christianized. So they need to differentiate which part of culture is just culture, and which part of culture is religion. That leads precisely to this differentiation. What happens was that this differentiation with the Jesuits in China made, brought to Europe, and there Voltaire, Leibniz, and the others said, fine, you say that Chinese culture is almost ready before revelation. We don't need revelation, give us Chinese culture without revelation. So the project of the Enlightenment is to appropriate Chinese culture to precisely bring enlightenment to Europe, getting rid of revelation. But, I mean, this is a complex transformation, how the Chinese rites, eventually the conflict led to the secularization of culture or to the deschristianization of culture in Europe. But basically the first step is, first, the separation of cultural rites which are purely cultural and those which are religious and therefore idolatrous and therefore cannot be. And this was what the whole Malabar rites and Chinese rites was all about. And of course, it led to a big conflict between the Pope and the Chinese Emperor, between the French King and all the religious orders, the Jesuits, eventually bringing to an end the Jesuits in order. But it is this controversial formula of Jesuit cultural accommodation, and maybe let me just read this. Let's go back. So cultural accommodation, we must, again, because sometimes it is, these cunning Jesuits, look, they were proselytizers and that's why they invented this method. No, the method was not invented by Europeans. The method was pushed by the locals to the European missionaries. It was the Japanese that told Valeriano, look, you cannot try to Portugalize us. If you want to succeed here, if you want to have a serious encounter with us, you have to dress like us, wash yourself like us, eat like us, become Japanese. And Ricci, who came to China as a Buddhist monk, was told by his friends, no, abandon this habit and adopt the Confucian habit. So it was always the locals that told the Jesuits so accommodation was not a kind of an intellectual strategy developed by the Jesuits. It was a praxis that emerged out of the intercultural encounter itself. And this is the famous and controversial formula of accommodation. Matteo Ricci to adopt the habitus of Confucian literatus in China, Roberto de Nobile to adopt the Brahman habitus in India, Jesuits in the reduction del Paraguay to adopt the Guarani habitus, but also the less commendable accommodating habitus of a slave owner in the Jesuit slave plantations in Maryland. In Maryland, they were the greatest. They had the largest slave plantations, which financed my university, Georgetown College. You know all the controversy in the last 2 years about slavery in Georgetown, how even when they sold the slaves, they didn't emancipate the slaves, but actually sold them to finance precisely Georgetown University, and in Brazil. And of course, then this brings the question of what is cultural that should be incorporated into universal humanity, human rights, and which parts of culture perhaps is incompatible with the sacred dignity of the human person and therefore needs to be left behind. We have these discussions today about how universal are our human rights, how much we should simply accommodate genital cutting in Africa, because it's an old cultural custom of Africa. Which part of culture are to become universalizable as part of humanity, and which ones are to a certain extent in conflict with what we will call today human rights. So it was the differentiation of true universal religion and particular cultures, first introduced by the Jesuits, as well as that between civilization and idolatry, that allow the various accommodating syntheses of supposedly global Christian universalism and local cultural particularism. This is the key to the Jesuit formula of globalization, a formula which was very much attacked by everybody in Rome, in Paris, and by Jesuits themselves. Let me end simply giving you an illustration of the intercultural encounter, the Jesuit, perhaps the paradigmatic one, by looking at the map. This is a map, the Matteo Ricci world map, a copy of which, one of them, is here at the Library of Congress. As you can see, there are 6 prints, whatever you call them in Chinese. And what is interesting of this map, if you look, is it is neither Sinocentric nor Eurocentric. So this is a map made together between a European and Chinese, and somehow what came out of it is that neither China is the center of the world, as they were convinced they were, nor Europe was the center of the world, as Europeans were convinced they were. So the center of the world, dividing East and West, is somewhere west of Japan, going down the Pacific Islands, not discovered yet Australia, Oceania has not yet been discovered, and the East is the West. The Americas are the East, and all of the old world, so the new world is the East, the new world is the West. And in this sense, it decenters both Eurocentrism and Sinocentrism. But it's not only that, it is a map that fuses Western cartography techniques and Chinese cartography techniques. You cannot read it there, but the map is full of text. The Chinese maps have a lot of text telling you about each region of the world, how. So you have, again, I cannot read it, but there was a fantastic exhibit in the Matteo Ricci Institute in China and the Asian Society in San Francisco. And there was the translation of all these texts. If anything, this is the map that the Chinese adapted as the map that gave them a vision of the world, of the new world before the world they knew. And for 200 years, for 300 years, This is the map that served, with some revisions later. Verbies, another Jesuit, would update this map. But basically, this map serves as the map for China, Korea, and Japan until the middle of the 19th century. This was the map of the world the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese used as precisely world maps. And of course, it happens to be that Matteo Ricci had to come up with Chinese names for every European city. So most of the names that Chinese use today for European cities are basically names that Matteo Ricci invented to a certain extent, right? Phonetically, how to transliterate, let's say, European cities into Chinese characters. But it's not only that. Really, it was a work of communication, collaboration between several Chinese and Matteo Ricci. So it was not Matteo Ricci bringing Western science to the Chinese. It was this precisely encounter. And this was characteristic also of his book on friendship, which I already mentioned, the aphorisms, which was the way in which, again, from memory, I'm sure you're familiar with the classic by Spence, the Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci, and of course in a culture like the Chinese, in which memorizing is extremely highly regarded, everybody was awed by the ability of Matteo Ricci in these dinners they would have with literati, where they would basically read them a text in Chinese, and he will be able to basically read it back from the last character to the first character. But it was the kind of in his catechism, the way in which basically he integrates a kind of Confucian cosmology and vision of the world and the Chinese and the Western cosmology that comes out of creationism. But the same we could say of many others. José de Acosta in the Americas, he's the author of the Catechism of Lima, but from the beginning the Catechism of Lima was written in Latin and translated simultaneously to Spanish, Guarani, Quechua, and Aymara, because he said to become Christians, the natives of Latin America don't need to be Hispanized. This notion that to become Christian you need to be Hispanized, and therefore don't need to be Europeanized. You have to Christianize, or you have to Guaranize Christianity, and this is what I mentioned before of the Guaranis. Anyhow, the Jesuits serve as pioneer interlocutors in the religious, cultural, scientific, and artistic encounters between East and West, and between the old and new worlds in the early modern global era. And as we are entering a multipolar, decentered world in which we have to become, again, able to enter in communication with other forms of thinking, with other forms of conceiving the human person, with other models of democracy, with other models of organization of the common good and the good life, I think that the lessons of the Jesuits in early modernity are still there. They didn't find solutions, but we don't have solutions ourselves either. We're still struggling with the same conflicts between universality and particularity, between globality and locality that they struggle with. And so it's not that they have given us a model how to become global today, but at least it helps us to perhaps decenter our own Western-centric, modernist conception of what the globe is going to look in 50 years from now. Thank you very much. Too much, overwhelming. I'm sorry. There are a lot of Jesuits here. Maybe the Jesuits can have some questions, some objections, some. Please.
Thank you very much, Calvin. Hello, thank you very much, José, for this fascinating lecture. Many questions, but one that stands out is in contemporary discussions of globalization, there's often a focus on the tendency of globalization to flatten, standardize, homogenize the cultures of the world. And I was struck in listening to your lecture about this early modern instantiation of globalization that there seemed to be a tension still between the reproduction, as you put it, of Jesuit institutions, the isomorphic reproduction, which implies, this kind of replication of the same structure globally. And similarly also the replication of the Jesuit way of proceeding. And on the other hand, this kind of relativism, syncretism, accommodation of other cultures, languages, etc., into the very fold of Christianity. And I'm wondering if you could speak more to that tension. I mean, isn't there still a standardization at work, perhaps, in this process? I'd be very curious to hear.
Well, there is always, of course. So I use the college and the isomorphic because you may be familiar, the Stanford School of Globalization, the so-called world polity, that basically asks itself, we think that nation states creates those forms, but the fact that these forms are recreated everywhere throughout the world isomorphically is an indication that each nation state is simply basically a receiver of a world polity which is above all of us. And the argument I'm making is, for this world polity to emerge, this world society, somebody had to contribute. And one of the most clear, one of the most important institutions has been reproduced isomorphically around the world is, of course, the university and the college. And they were, in this respect, somebody who were able to take this institutional form, make it their own, and then reproduce it isomorphically. So in this respect, there are elements already of this standardization there. But I'm more interested in the others where they don't try to standardize, but enter into truly dialogue. And relativism, of course, this is what they were accused of. I mean, if you read Pascal, the provincial letters, he's just making fun of these Jesuits who have no principles. They simply are willing to accommodate anything just for whatever. And so the notion of that they being absolute moral relativists with no principle, while of course we will call them today moral contextualists. They realize that those principles have to be applied, accommodated in each particular context in its own way. And the same goes with the Jansenists, of course, the French Catholic Jansenists were the first and some of the most radical critics of the Jesuits. And a friend of Pascal, Etienne Pasquier, in his famous Catechism des Jesuits, basically calls them a hermaphrodite religious order. Hermaphrodite because they are neither religious nor secular. It's the first definition of laïcité. They simply do not accept this differentiation between the religion and the secular. They are scientists, and they are cartographers, and they are musicians, and they construct canons. They are everything. They want to be basically find God in all things, right? It is this which, of course, made them, on the one hand, pioneers because they, out of this impulse, they are the proto-scientists, the proto-astronomers, the proto-everything, but later modern science will take over and then will develop this in a more standardized form that imposes a Western form of logic and of Western metaphysical conceptions, which today we are in the process of, again, to a certain being challenged in some places. We have no idea how, let's say, once India and China emerge truly as global powers, they may challenge our own conceptions of anthropological conceptions of the self, the will, transmigration of souls. I mean, the debates they had in India and in China in the 17th century with Buddhists, with Hindus, about transmigration of souls, radically different concepts of the self, of the free will. Basically, those are issues that any contemporary global philosophy will have to take into account, that we cannot simply dictate Western conceptions of anthropological concepts of the self, concepts of the will, cannot be simply globalized in a homogenizing form, but we will have to adapt other cultures. So in this respect, I think that there are issues that certainly, as we are talking of multiculturalism, in the high level of integration of worldviews from other civilizations. If we are going to think of a global, let's say, ratio studiorum, liberal arts, humanities education, which incorporates not only the Western classics, but all the classics of humanity and the experience of all human cultures, then obviously it cannot be a standardizing method. It will have to be one which integrates through dialogue very different currents into perhaps not a fully synthetic, maybe cacophonic, but nonetheless one which incorporates all these visions of humanity. Yes.
It's essentially time for the reception. I have a question, but it's a very long question, so I think I might ask my question privately. But does anyone have a brief question for Jose?
I'm sorry I spoke so long.
We can all ask at the reception. So on that note, why don't we conclude the question and answer and go to the reception. Thank you, Jose, for a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.